Hello and welcome back to part 5 of a 10-part series GNAT-TV and other community access centers around Vermont across the Vermont Access Network are hosting in partnership with the Vermont Council on Rural Development and the Barre Times Argus and Rutland Herald newspapers. I'm Andrew McClure, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. This 10-part series is about ideas for the future of Vermont and looks at what are some of the big questions that are facing the state as we emerge out of the pandemic and into whatever lies ahead. What are some of the big issues that are facing the state in coming years, and how will we go about tackling them? Upcoming topics will include such areas as education, childcare, business development, civic engagement, and several others. So far, we've talked about broadband development, welcoming new Vermonters, climate change and its relationship to the state's economy, and economic disparities within the state. If you've missed one or want to get caught up in some of the previous discussions, you can visit the website futureofvermont.org/explore, and you can find not only the previous telecasts that we've done, but also the written opinion pieces that have been published in the Herald and the Times Argus, and also the podcast versions of our shows in case you'd rather just listen. Today, our topic is about localization and creating resilient economies. And specifically, this fifth proposition reads, Vermont must relocalize energy, agriculture, and business investment for a resilient economy. With us today to discuss this point are Paul Costello, who is the Executive Director of the Vermont Council on Rural Development. Ellen Kahler is the Executive Director of the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, a nonprofit organization created by the state legislature in 1995 to partner with state government, private sector businesses, and nonprofits to build a thriving economic, social, and ecological future for Vermont. We're also very pleased to have with us today Mary McClure, who is the President and CEO of Green Mountain Power, the state's largest electric utility. She is also serving as the chairwoman of Governor Scott's pandemic employer and technical support team during this past year. So welcome all. Great to have you all with us today. This topic is really, I guess, around the future of energy and local foods and forest products as fundamental to the economy and way of life in Vermont. And I guess I was just wondering, Paul, if perhaps you could get us started here and sort of summarize what the proposition involves and perhaps a bit of the background as to how it made it onto the list of the 10 propositions you developed.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, and thanks for hosting this. I guess this is the 5th out of 10. Really appreciate your leadership. Really appreciate GNAT for producing these shows and the whole network of public access stations for showing these. And it's an honor to be here with these two guests, really important Vermont leaders. When VCRD looks at the issue of resilience, we think it begins at home. It begins with local foods, begins with strong communities, begins with the neighborliness that we saw after in the middle of the COVID crisis. It begins with a strong infrastructure and particularly strong energy systems that power our homes, power our economy, and provide the quality of life that we need. So when we think of the opportunities for the future of Vermont, we see a future where we've dramatically expanded local agriculture and forest products in ways that provide for local needs and cycle dollars locally. And at the same time, we stimulate value-added development. One of the fundamental challenges on the forest products and agricultural side is that all too often, we've been stuck at the bottom of commodity economies where we can't control prices. We're at the mercy of national and international supply chains that build these business models that sometimes don't work in Vermont because of our landscape, because of the quality of life and the way that we want to treat employees and so forth. And we can go into all that. But there's a huge opportunity in this. It's also part of when you think of young people and their attraction to the land and the lessons of COVID around how important food was and the disruption of even what came into our grocery stores in just a few days. We see how urgent it is to have stronger resilience, but also to cycle those dollars that strengthen the food system. The other side is that in an age of climate change, we're looking at energy in really new ways. We're looking at decarbonizing the energy structure, and in the center of that has got to be beneficial electrification. That, right now we ship a couple of $2 billion out of the state to purchase carbon-based fuels that are deeply undermining the long-term sustainability of this planet. And we're all part of it. We all have to work together to lead. And part of our provision around the climate economy is that places that lead in clean energy development, in smart grid, in battery storage, and other features of the new economy and energy, and replace carbon-based fuels in doing so, are going to stimulate economic activity, creativity, invention, and they're also going to attract purposive young people. They're going to build places that are dynamic centers for the future, because young people want to see change. They want to see commitment. And so having Green Mountain Power here and Mary to speak for the work that they've done is really important, because they're cutting edge nationally. They are nationally recognized for their leadership and are an amazing model. The other utilities in Vermont are doing really great things too. But it's wonderful to be here with people who can help flesh this out a little bit in terms of the opportunities ahead for Vermont.
All right. Well, how localized are we already? I mean, the idea of local VOR, local food, local energy has always been, I think, fairly popular within the state. But I just wondered if you could give us a sense as to what more might need to be done, or are we already in a pretty good place? And Ellen, perhaps I'll invite you to get us going here on that one. Are we already pretty well down the track on that, or is there still much progress to be made?
Both. We've made a lot of progress over the last decade, and we have a long way still to go. So what we know right now is that over the last 10 years, Vermont's economic output in the food system has expanded 48% and now represents $11.3 billion worth of economic activity. And $3 billion of that is actually in food manufacturing, which is, interestingly, our second largest manufacturing type industry in the state. Over the last 10 years, we've added over 6,500 net new jobs, and there's over 64,000 Vermonters that are employed in the food system, in the private sector alone. There's over 11,500 farm and food businesses in the state. So it represents a really big part of our economy. It's a big part of our heritage. It's a big part of what we want to continue in the future. What we know is that as of 2017, we were at about 14% local food consumption. So that was about $310 million. We have a new plan out, a new 10-year plan to get us to 2030. And we've set a target of getting to 25% local food and beverage consumption, which we think it's going to be a real stretch. It's going to take a lot of investment, a lot of focus, but we also feel like it's something we have to do, because, as Paul said, when we spend our dollars locally, those dollars circulate in our economy and add the multiplier effect to our local economy. That's not to say that Vermont is ever going to be an island. If you have 25% local consumption, that means 75% of what we're eating is still coming from someplace else. So we're part of a regional effort to try to increase regional food consumption by 2030 to the point of 30%. And that's because we want to shorten our supply chains for food. We've really seen the fragility of our food supply chains during COVID. And as Paul said, we want to build a food system that's really resilient. On the forest product side, they have really suffered a lot of declines in part because they're part of the commodity system more. They are a $1.9 billion industry and have about a little shy of 10,000 jobs in that sector. And that's been we used to be at 10,000 jobs, and now we're at about 6,000 jobs in the sector. So we have a lot of rebuilding to do in our forest products economy. So we're working on that as well. So maybe I'll stop there and let Mary talk a little bit about energy then.
Great, thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be here and talk about this really, really, really important topic that I think the pandemic has shined a tremendous light on what it means to be resilient. And I think we've all felt that over the last 14 months, emotionally resilient, physically resilient, socially resilient, all kinds of ways that we've had to tap into that for ourselves and our communities. And I just think we've talked a lot at GMP about a crisis being one part danger and one part opportunity. And I'm sure you've all heard that too over the last year. And, I truly believe that Vermont has a wonderful opportunity to leverage what we've all just gone through and create a much, much stronger state. And I feel very grateful to be a part of that with the many leaders across the state. So, and I have to agree with Ellen, when you think about energy in our state, you think about where we've been and where we're going. The answer to your question, Andrew, is both. We have done a tremendous amount over the last 10 to 15 years in the state, really localizing and regionalizing our electricity supply. And we also have a long way to go. And I'm very pleased to join energy leaders in Vermont that are quite unique from other states and other parts of our country. So I always like to remind folks that our electricity system is really one of the most impressive machines that humankind have created. And we have built the machine over 100 years ago at this point, really starting far away from where electricity is consumed. So think of the old electricity system being one that was generation was far, far away from the community. It was very centralized generation plants, and then poles and wires carrying that electricity to homes and businesses and communities in a what I like to call a one-way path. And what we've done over the last 10 years is really bring that generation closer to where it is being consumed. And that has allowed us to unlock clean energy systems, both in Vermont and regionally. So think of the solar systems you see, the solar rooftop systems you see on people's homes, the wind farms you see around the state, the small and medium and large size hydro systems you see both in Vermont and regionally. Those systems are all bringing the generation that we need in our homes, in our businesses, in our communities, much, much closer, much more localized to where it is being used. And that is a wonderful example of the way Vermont is making our communities more resilient. And then on top of that, the next 10 years are going to look and feel much more like a two-way system where we're really leveraging the local energy systems that are here and communicating and connecting them to make Vermont much, much more resilient. And you heard Paul reference things like storage. That's a technology over the next 10 years that you're going to see just explode throughout the country, but also in Vermont. We have already battery storage systems in the state. We've been a national leader in deploying those, and we're going to continue to deploy those. I have this moonshot idea that every home in Vermont will eventually have a battery. Every business will eventually have storage capability. And why that's important is because what it brings to us is resiliency, local resiliency. And we'll be able to withstand the impacts that we no doubt have already felt from weather, unpredictable extreme weather. We've seen it, really horrible events, what happened in Texas. We've seen the wildfires in California, the Australian wildfires just shortly before the pandemic. And Vermont is not immune to those things. We've seen horrible extreme weather systems come through. And imagine a world where we're able to continue our energy systems, notwithstanding those weather events, and our poles and wires that you see really become more of the backup system. And people's homes and their businesses, and even within their communities, they have energy systems that remain there for them that are clean and cost effective when we do get hit with weather like that. And then the poles and wires, we fix them, but they're the backup system. And that's really how we view the next 10 years to really create a much, much more resilient future for Vermont.
It might be useful to have perhaps flesh out what we mean by resilient. That's a term I've heard used a couple of million times now since the last 13 months or so. I assume it means sort of having backups to backups, or being flexible and adaptable, to changing circumstances. But is that what all three of you think of when you hear the term resiliency? Is that what we're talking about, or is there more to it than that?
To me, the word is, it's kind of a hard word for some people to get around, and it's also sometimes a buzzword. So I feel a little cautious using it, but it's a little bit like sustainability. It's not an end thing where we do this work and then we're done and we're all resilient. In fact, the world is changing. We learned lessons from Hurricane Irene in terms of how we work together in crisis. COVID has taught us an enormous amount about following science, thinking about some of the systems that you need to be prepared for challenges like COVID, and certainly for disease control. But we can't just be prepared to deal with the last crisis, the last flood, the COVID, or something like it. Science also tells us about the approach of cascading impacts from climate change that are, Mary mentioned the fires, and we know that rising sea levels are going to displace populations. That could lead to tremendous stress in different places in the world that are at carrying capacity ecologically right now in some ways, or beyond it, where people are having to leave their places because the land can't support them. So we need to look at a world that has a dynamic equilibrium, and we need to be as prepared as possible to adjust and to be successful as a society in those kind of conditions that are coming. And to me, that's the resilience problem. It's not a done deal. It's an awareness and a planning and a coordination. And part of it comes down to, you think about COVID response, a lot of it was neighbor to neighbor, people helping out other people. And that's the first foundation, is at the community level. But then systems, an energy system that doesn't shut down when there's an attack on the grid, or when there's an incident that affects a big weather incident that affects the weather. The fact that we're growing as much of our food as we can in Vermont and have that kind of stability and support for food. But the other side is that we have a strong economy. One of the cool things about the food system is we want to expand our local sales and local purchasing, but there's a lot of businesses in Vermont that are doing, they're not going to the bottom of the commodity economy. They're going to the top. They're Jasper Hill Cheese. They're the Alchemist. They're the Vermont Creamery, and they're making incredibly wonderful products that we all love here, but that also fetch great price in international markets. And the dollars that come in support workforce and people living in Vermont. So looking at how we have a strong community and strong economy that can weather storms to come and can give us, can sustain families for the future is sort of fundamental. And so I guess it kind of takes in an awful lot if you look at it like that. But that's just my take. I'm glad to hear what others think.
Well, I concur with Paul, and a lot of it is about diversity, right? And it's redundancy. So over the last 50 years in the food system, what we have seen is a real consolidation in production, in processing, in distribution, in retail sales. There's fewer and fewer very large multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies who are controlling the production and the flow and the ownership of the food that ends up in our grocery stores, for instance. And we know that about 68% of all Vermonters get the primary amount of their food from grocery stores. So this is a big deal. And so because of that, it's made the system actually very fragile, because there's all this vertical integration that's happened to try to get rid of redundancy. So then, as we saw during a year ago, when there were COVID outbreaks in meat processing plants in the Midwest, whether there was having to till under vegetable crops in Florida, it was all because they weren't able to get those products to market, or because there was a sickness and that then they didn't have enough workers to be able to process the animals on a very tight timeline and a tight schedule that then, in essence, broke the system for several weeks. So our view of resiliency, and we need to think about it in terms of New England or the Northeast, is how do we create a resilient food system within the Northeast where a greater and greater percentage of our food is being produced here and stays here, right? It doesn't get exported to California and then we bring in California lettuce. Like, we produce lettuce here and it stays here, right? Because if we have that kind of diversity of production, diversity of types of businesses at all different scales of operation, when there are crises, we are going to be able to weather those storms. And we saw this, right? During COVID, people were not feeling comfortable going to grocery stores where they normally shop. What did they do? They went to their local farmers location, and farmers responded by having more farm stands, right? And so you could look at that from an efficiency standpoint and say, well, that's really redundant. Like, if you have these big stores, you want to have the food going there. The problem is the way that our system has evolved, the structures of it, the rules of engagement, so to speak, how products get on a shelf, for instance. It does not enable local producers to really meet that need without, for instance, people coming to them in this particular case. So when we think about the next 10 years, we think about building in resiliency for the food system over the next 10 years. That's what it's about. It's about having a multitude of market locations. It's a multitude of different scales of operation. It's a multitude of business ownership models. It's a multitude of products that we eat and that are core to what we eat. But it's also, what can we export to other Northeast states, because we can gain greater value, because we know we have a big food insecurity problem here in Vermont. On the forest product side, we've been incredibly dependent upon pulp mills in Maine. And when those mills went out, it basically took out the bottom part of the low-grade wood market in our state. So we need to think about new types of products that we could be producing here in Vermont based on the kind of trees that we grow here and the incredible craftsmanship that exists in the forest products industry. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. So you can take a lot of what Paul and Ellen said there and apply it to the energy world as well, as we look to define what we really mean by resiliency. One way we think about it here as well is to compare it to a very common term or very traditional term in energy of reliability. And what's the difference between reliability and resiliency? And we really think of reliability as a much more reactive framework. And you're really asking the question, are utilities or GMPs required to keep the lights on? And reliability describes really our ability to do that and to meet the outcome. So it's a very reactive, are the lights on or question. Resiliency, on the other hand, is a much more proactive framework, is how we look at it, and really describes more of our efforts and projects in the state and partnerships that we have with customers to achieve the reliability. So you can ask yourself the question, can we, or how should we withstand and recover quickly from major storms, other catastrophes, or some combination of events that we may or may not have ever experienced? And that's how we think of resiliency. So it's about preparing for and operating through and recovering from significant events that might happen on our energy system, and really bringing resiliency to a local level. So when I think of local, literally meaning in our homes and in our businesses, when I think of what Ellen just described about redundancy and really New England and the region, we have that same model here. So we want to bring resiliency to the home and to the community, and we want our backup to be quite regional. A good example of that is Texas and what happened in that state when they were faced with an extreme weather event. They were insular just to Texas. And when they needed help from other generation sources, they were not interconnected. And in New England, certainly that type of weather event that happened in Texas, we're used to in New England. So our systems are weatherized, so to speak, winterized, and are ready for that type of event. But of course, there is a extreme, unexpected, difficult to forecast weather event that could come to Vermont. And we want to be able to have resiliency in our communities. Think microgrids and islands where if a weather event came in that way and we were having to rely on our region to help us, we want to be able to do that. And it just goes to Ellen's point on redundancy, and have our local communities able to be up and running in the event that we're fixing our system or our system's facing something that was difficult for us to prepare for. So a good example of resiliency is a GMP project that we'll be finishing up this spring, early summer in Panton, Vermont, where we have a large solar farm and a utility scale, or in other words, a big battery attached to that solar farm. And we can have up to 900 customers in Panton connected to that solar and battery. And if we need to, we can unhook them from the larger grid, and those 900 customers will be able to function completely with their energy needs off that solar and that battery while we work on our system and get it back up and running. And we're calling those resiliency zones, and we're hoping to have to do many more throughout the state. So think maybe the town buildings are connected to that resiliency zone. A grocery store, access to food systems are connected to that resiliency zone. So if an event like Texas happened to Vermont, we would have areas in the state that with very local resiliency and very local generation can remain up and running. And we can also still rely on our region for help if we ever need it, and we're there to help our others in the region as well.
Andrew, if I could, I just want to add something to what Mary said, because electrons, i.e. our electricity, are things that can be stored in a battery, and then they can be deployed. And in essence, the limit to them is just how much we can generate. But when it comes to food, there's a growing season. There is perishability, right? Milk has to be processed within 24 hours. So, and has a shelf life. So when we think about how do we build in resiliency and redundancy in our food system, it is an additional consideration is how do we actually increase overall production of food, and then how do we store it? How do we move it around throughout the state in an efficient manner, because it has to get consumed in a relatively short time frame. And so getting back to that diversity of production scales and types of businesses, another key piece of that is around individual growing of a certain portion of your own food, right? One of the things we saw during COVID was an explosion of the number of people putting in gardens. Sometimes for the first time, high mowing seeds up in Wolcott blew out of their seeds last year and had something like 600% growth in their sales of seeds, because people are realizing wow, I need to actually do something to take care of my family. And I think one of the key things around this that we really need to address for the next 10 years is really explicitly redressing the racial inequities and historical disenfranchisements and exclusion of Black, Indigenous people of color from businesses, from land ownership, and that it's essential in the relocalization of our food system to address those through reparations, through land, making sure there's enough capital and land for BIPOC and Abenaki residents to be able to have what they need from a self-sufficiency standpoint, but also to be able to grow, to get into the marketplace. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's an important dimension to resiliency and to diversification. So we need to have one of the scales is also that backyard gardener, having some amount of food that they're producing, they're putting by, they're putting in their freezer, those kinds of things.
I guess I was wondering if you, both of you, could speak to what you see as sort of the biggest challenges facing rolling out your respective visions of more resiliency and more localization in energy and food production, forest products, whatever. Mary, perhaps we'll invite you to comment on this one first. What is the big concern in your mind as you think about the future of where you want to take Green Mountain Power and electric generation and your other services in the state? What is the stumbling block that emerges first when you start thinking about that?
So first, I think about connectivity in the state, and for the system that we've been working on over the last 10 years to really leverage it over the next, we need Vermonters connected. And to really unlock the value of clean generation being very close to where it is being used, and for the good of all of the state and all of our customers, we need to connect those systems together. You may have heard of programs we have where when there is peak demand on our system, think of a really, really hot summer day, folks are home and consuming a lot of electricity as they might have air conditioners on or otherwise. On those days, instead of GMP having to go to the market and purchase power that is not only expensive, but also clean as we would like it, we have a fleet of battery and storage throughout our system that decreases costs for all of our customers. So in the last 2 summers, as we've tapped into our power walls that folks have in their homes, we've been able to save millions of dollars at those peak moments. But it needs connectivity. And we need Vermonters to be connected digitally. It is, and that's certainly something that so many people in the state are working on and have been working on, and I think coming off the pandemic is quite a priority for us to figure out here in Vermont. But that's a necessary part of this. I think about electrification all those years ago, and when we started our efforts to reach all parts of the state to electrify, I feel very much like that is our moment now when it comes to connectivity. So when I think about how does Vermont really become more resilient in our energy systems, we have to have connectivity throughout the state. And it goes to Ellen's point as well with our BIPOC and Abenaki communities. Like, we've got to get them, ensure that they are connected and a part of this, and energy equity concerns are also a part of that connectivity issue for us, and something we think about a lot, and really feel like we've got to break through those barriers in the state.
Yeah, I would say, the biggest challenge, some of the biggest challenges we have is, you think about food production. How does that happen? It happens on land. Land is a finite resource. We're not growing land, right? The planet is the planet. So there's a lot of development pressure on our prime ag land that we need to really address. If we want to achieve 25 or 30% local production, we have got to, in the next 10 years, secure the land base, which means we need to look at land use planning. We need to look at the cost of land. We need to look at our regulatory framework, because if we really truly as a state want to be producing a larger percentage of what we eat so that we can be resilient, that we can survive climate change, all of those things, we have to protect the land base. And a big challenge in doing so is this notion of the generational transfer of farm assets. that there are a lot of existing very large landholders who are in the farm community who don't have the next generation of family farm member, or even a non-family member identified yet. So there's a huge need to accelerate the rate at which we are working with farm families to figure out their generational transfer and start moving in that direction when the time is right. The other thing we have is changing consumer preferences and markets. So we have to be really adaptive. We were really, our dairy as the foundation of our agricultural production has been for a large part of that industry has been a commodity that doesn't have a story to it, that doesn't have a connection to place attached to it, other than just saying it's from Vermont. There's a lot of opportunity, and we're seeing that in the cheese industry, for instance, and in the organic grass-fed dairy movement, where there is that story, or Vermont Creamery. What is the story? That is what consumers want. So we have to be adaptive. We have to be able to meet those consumer interests. And then, like in the forest products industry, the same thing applies to dairy. Because of the regulated marketplace and the global marketplace that both dairy and forest products businesses operate in, they are price takers, not price makers. And so as a result, there is this real crisis that we need to address about how do we at least get a greater percentage of what we're producing to be price makers, right? Through value added, through controlling the market channels and the outlets to be able to reach customers, to tell our story and of the place that this is grown, the terroir of the flavors of our food, those kinds of things, the incredible quality of our hardwood timber. In the forest product side, fragmentation is a huge issue. It's the opposite, it's the corollary to the farm side, is that you have people moving up largely from outside the state who are buying a 10-acre sliver of farmland or a forest land, and they're putting a house on it. And then what ends up happening is that 10 acres is not really then viable in terms of bringing in a logging operation to do selective cutting over time. So we need to maintain large blocks of land and protect it from development if we're going to have a resilient food and a resilient forest product sector, for sure.
Well, I'd love to just share a couple of reflections on what both of you are saying, because I think I'm so excited by the way that you guys think. I think that part of the fundamental problem and challenge that you asked about, Andrew, is business models for different kinds of creative enterprises that solve problems. And in the food system, everything Ellen's saying is true. What are all the ways through regulation, through incentives, through land conservation, through potentially leveraging R&D investments and enterprises that we can stimulate the whole chain of value-added production that really brings the dollars home in that arena? I have a vision for food systems where Vermont is the breadbasket of New England. We're already the milk bowl. Let's be the cheese bowl. Let's be the beer garden. Let's be the vegetable platter. Let's we have the land and we have the creativity and we have the people on the land who are working today. We have 90 million customers within a day's drive, and we have an opportunity to seize market. And on the forest product side, we're shipping more than half of our logs out of the state for production. We're shipping some of them, some good saw logs, to China for production and buying them back through Lowe's. That's just bad economics. Michael Schneider, the Commissioner of Forest Parks and Recreation, was just describing how it's like if we were tapping trees for sap and bringing it to Maine, to have Maine turn it into maple syrup and get the high-end value, the dollars actually that come from that commodity. On the electric side, I think that the challenge of dealing with heat and transportation, which are the big producers of carbon emissions right now. We have the cleanest grid in the country right now, thanks to GMP, the other utilities, and Velco. We have a really creative matrix of leadership there that's doing something unique. But heat and transportation are still major emitters of carbon. And they're also, we're sending dollars out of state to pay for stuff that if we invested in clean energy production in Vermont, you'd be cycling those dollars in our communities and creating jobs. So I love the Green Mountain Power vision of facilitating the exchange of electrons. Like I'm in a situation where in Montpelier, you're able to sign on and be part of a group solar project where we and our neighbors have signed on together. We get a reduction in our cost of energy through the Green Mountain Power contract with the solar folks that benefits us financially. At the same time, we're basically buying entirely local clean energy. You know, electrons, we may not get electron to electron through the grid, but there's a facilitation there that's really cool. And it lets us think about working with Green Mountain Power to also get a free charger and go from a gas-driven vehicle to an electric vehicle. This is a national movement. It's an international movement. It's something that the governor's leading on, that ARPA dollars are going to come into, and we have the opportunity to go to scale. So I see these as sort of fundamental business transition challenges, but also just enormous opportunities for the renewal of the state of Vermont in the next 3 to 5 years. So, and the last thing I'd say is that when Mary talks about the connection between the smart grid and universal broadband service, that's a fundamental part of the propositions that we've been sharing in terms of the first proposition on the list, not the most important, but the first one, which is universal broadband service to every home and business in Vermont.
It's a really important point to know about Vermont and an incredible reflection of the work we've done over the last decade. We are the cleanest state in the country with respect to electricity. We have a number of utilities that are already 100% renewable. Green Mountain Power is committed to getting there by 2030 and getting to 100% carbon free by 2025. Vermont Electric Co-op under Rebecca Town's leadership just recently announced getting 100% carbon free by 2023. So we have really important work we're still doing there, but Paul, he's exactly right. Transportation and heating are the two areas in this state that continue, while our electricity sector is getting cleaner and cleaner, we're still seeing our greenhouse gas emissions go up. And that's largely due to those two sectors. And over the next several years, the transportation sector in particular, as you hear about what some of our national manufacturers are doing, they're moving their new vehicles to electric at an incredible pace. Ford, General Motors, and so we're going to see these vehicles on the lots in Vermont very soon. But they're quite expensive, and they're going to be quite expensive for a while. And I think having policies in the state that are helping Vermonters get into those vehicles will be really important to influencing lowering our greenhouse gas emissions. And then, you know, our charging infrastructure throughout the state, how best to offer fast charging for Vermonters that have these vehicles will be really another really important part of it, in addition to ascertaining how best to go about heating. And we do have heat pumps, and that's been a form of electrification over the last several years that's been very useful for many Vermonters. But we've got a long way to go there, and very important leaders, including Neil Underville at VGS, that are working on how do we really clean up the air we're breathing in our buildings and in our homes. How do we make it cleaner? And that'll be a really important challenge and opportunity, as Paul pointed out, over the next 10 years.
Where will the labor force for all these sustainable jobs come from? Are they already here and it's just a matter of getting people either trained or retrained? Or do we need to be thinking a little bit about where the future farmers are coming from, or the future loggers, or the future electricians?
Andrew, I'm glad you brought that up, because it is a huge need, and it's impacting every sector, as we hear all the time. In the farm and food space, in the forest product space, it is absolutely the case that there are jobs that are available that go unfilled, and that is holding back economic expansion of these businesses that have products that consumers want, but they can't get enough of those products to market. Just recently, there was a slaughter facility that called up and said, we have 10 openings. And they improved their wages and their benefits in order to try to attract folks, but they're in a part of the state where it's really hard to get workers and skilled workers. So if you think about what we need to be investing in over the next 10 years, we need to radically transform our career and tech education centers. We need to invest in those facilities. We need to create really even more robust educational and training facilities that young Vermonters who maybe aren't going to go on to getting a degree because they don't necessarily need one, that they can get into the trades, that they can get into production processing, for instance. And then the other big component is investing in Vermont Technical College in Randolph because of their ag and food and forest programs there. They really have the ability to train the next generation of farmers, food entrepreneurs, and forest products owners in both a 2-year as well as a 4-year degree. I mean, we do have UVM, we have Sterling College, but in terms of the actual technical skills that we need for the next generation of business owners and farmers, we have to invest in places like the CTEs and Vermont Technical College, or we're not going to have the workers that we need.
One of the huge issues that's behind this, the demographic challenge we have, the historic loss of youth that we've seen, is just we have a low birth rate. And it's not like when I was a kid where people had 8 children. You know, people just don't do that. And so Vermont's population, especially in rural areas and especially in places that have more economic doldrums, has declined. And the proportion of people who are in the workforce has declined dramatically. And so we need to think about who's going to be the workforce of the future. And it comes back to that propositions show that you led recently, Andrew, that we really need to think about how we invite people of color to Vermont, how we invite new immigrants to Vermont, how we see the Vermont identity change, and how we welcome and set the conditions so that everyone has a deep sense of belonging here. So we're not, you know, we have issues like everywhere around racism, and there's incidents in Vermont that are disturbing and that send terrible messages to people of color. And they also can feel very isolated as a minority here, but ultimately a majority nationally. And we need to be part of the creative future of the country, and we'll need to think about agriculture. How do we help people get on the land? How do we help people advance entrepreneurial opportunities in the food system? And, you know, how do we build our workforce so that we're successful in moving forward with all these opportunities in the future? They're all bound together. But again, I think there's a huge opportunity behind this. But it connects to our everything from culture to economic practice and policy.
Yeah, really quite agree with both Paul and Ellen's sentiments there. What we see at Green Mountain Power is we have been actually quite attractive to many folks outside of Vermont as they've heard about, you know, some of the innovative programs we've been doing and want to get more involved at a utility and in a state that's really leveraging that work. So we've been quite pleased as of late to hear from applicants who know that and are actually looking to move to a place where they feel like they could be really fulfilled in the clean energy sector. So Vermont very much stands out there as an attractive place to work. But actually in Vermont now, like as I look across the utility workforce demographic, we are very similar to Vermont itself. We have an aging demographic, an aging workforce at Green Mountain Power, and frankly, we don't have the diversity both in terms of BIPOC employees or gender diversity. We've been successful at the leadership ranks at GMP with gender diversity, which is great, but we have a long way to go in some of our trade-oriented positions. And so we've been very focused on that and really think that Vermont could be, again, a leader in how to bring inclusionary cultures both to our workplaces and our state in a way that frankly, contributes to the resiliency we're doing in our products. And so I see that as an important both challenge and opportunity for Vermont over the next 10 years. How do we really leverage inclusivity and build workforces that want to come here and stay here if they're already here because of that?
Do you think, as a result of the pandemic, that one of the big takeaways from all of this is that global supply chains have seen their glory days, and it's going to really provide a big impetus to get things more local than they are? Or is it still going to be the case that we're still going to need computer chips made in Taiwan and shipped to Detroit so that they can make cars? It seems like a very complicated situation, but it's one that seems to me, if we want to get local, we're going to have to figure it out.
In all of this, we are never going to be an island, as Ellen says. We're woven into the fabric of New England. We're woven into a global economy where you can, from your living room, you can order things directly from a retailer in Asia or in Africa. And there's an enormous opportunity in that for us to sell out of Vermont, as well as for us to connect with people around the world, culturally and in terms of products. So I think that the global interconnectivity in the economy is not going to go away. I think that it provides some opportunities, and the challenges that it presents, we need to address. In other words, when we look at the rollout of broadband, and we've talked about this in an earlier episode, we also need to look at how we strengthen local purchasing and use digital tools effectively to drive local commerce, so that you're going on the web to look for a book and it brings you to Bear Pond Books in Montpelier instead of Amazon, or you have that opportunity come right up for you. How do we make it easy to connect to our local economy first and cycle our dollars first? That's one of the challenges, but it's also, again, a big opportunity. And I think there's a lot more to it. I don't think, we don't want the international economy to break down. There's a benefit globally to the fact that people in other parts of the world are selling products to this country. The interconnectivity can help raise all boats. We don't want to have our standard of living in this country be one that's categorically different than people in Africa or different parts of Asia. In fact, we want to see progress so that there's more opportunity for people all across the world. But it has to be in terms of sustainability, resilience, clean energy, where we're protecting the planet, we're protecting the environment at the same time that we are boosting prosperity and fairness on a global scale. So, we want to seize opportunities, but we're going to be part of something bigger than us. We can't step away from that. Green Mountain Power purchases a fair amount of power from Quebec. There's ups and downs for that, but ultimately that's part of what has produced a relatively clean portfolio for us. So, I think it's a complicated question, but it's one that we're never going to be done wrestling with. What's our opportunity? How do we deal with the complexities of it? At least that's my take. I'd love to hear Ellen and Mary's perspectives.
Well, I think it's an existential question ultimately, right? What is the purpose? Is our economy to be in service to, or are human beings intended to be in service to the economy? So the question is, in my mind, the bigger question, the existential question is, what would it look like if we had a global and a local and a national economy that centered human well-being as opposed to the accumulation of wealth for a small number of people on this planet? Because that has been the ripple effect over the last 150 years. We have structured our economy. We have passed regulations and laws and set up our court systems and preferenced the ever increasingly large scale sized and consolidated organizations in business that have been to the detriment of the planet, to workers, to people, to communities, because of what we're centering. And I really want to be part of a conversation that thinks about what would it actually look like from a structure standpoint of our institutions, our regulations, our rules of engagement, the way our communities are set up? If we truly centered human well-being, that was the outcomes that we were trying to make sure, and everything else flowed to that. What kind of choices would we then make in terms of what we incent versus what we don't incent? That to me, that's like the essential question here at this pivot point in 2021.
I think we could spend a whole hour on this topic, would be my guess. But what comes to mind for me is it's an and. So I guess one way I could distill it down in an analogy is we've been talking a lot about at GMP about, well, what's the future of our work? How are we going to work on the other side of the pandemic? Are we going to still be remote? Are we all coming back to, and the answer is both. And it's a really unlocking the advantages that we have found in remote work and getting back to some of the advantages of being with each other in conference rooms and the collaboration. So that's how I view globalization. I don't think the answer to globalization is deglobalization. I think that, but what has been shown is that maybe our model up to this point wasn't sustainable, and it escalated certain risks. It escalated, the financial crisis, pandemic, climate change, rising inequality, all things a part of that previous model. And so we need to shift, really to a model that the flows of vaccines, for example. We really need cross-border flows while we also have resilient localization. And think about too, like what we're doing right now today. Never would have been something we imagined a year and a half, 2 years ago, where I can stay very local, but have a conversation with you all in different parts of the state. And same with travel and conferences. And, I'm able to, I did a conference just 2 weeks ago with a company in Iceland, and I didn't have to travel, and we were able to just connect. And it's, so I think it's going to be both, and we just got to get better at our globalization, and we have to get better at our local resilience.
Well, okay, we're going to have to leave it there for today. Unfortunately, I feel like we could talk for another hour around all of these subjects. It's really fascinating to hear from all of you, but we'll have to leave it there for now. But before we go, I just wanted to mention that next week we'll be talking on the sixth proposition, which is that Vermont must ensure all children and have access to affordable, quality childcare and education. Hope you can all tune in and catch that. And also wanted to thank our panelists today, Ellen Kahler of the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, Barre McClure, the CEO of Green Mountain Power, and of course, Paul Costello, the Executive Director of the Vermont Council on Rural Development, who basically were the ones who organized all this. And on that note, I also wanted to just mention that you should put in a little save the date on your calendars for May 26th from 1 to 5 p.m. That's when the Council on Rural Development will be hosting a summit on the future of Vermont, which will bring together a lot of the conversation lines that we've been talking about so far already, and will be over the next 4 or 5 weeks. So thanks again to all of our panelists. Thank you for being with us. Really a pleasure having the conversation with you all.